and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer, and the training we're doing today comes from the Office of Diversity. I'm really excited about being able to have Gwen introduce our speaker. The whole idea of bringing speakers into students is to expose ourselves to different types of thinking, different experiences that we may not have had. Being a Montana girl, I didn't have a lot of exposure to diversity, so whenever I'm able to hear people that have traveled from other places and lived in other places, worked as a professional, I'm always really excited to hear about that. I always feel like when I leave one of these events or get to know somebody and I get to learn from them, I feel like I've had a real rich experience. And so I'm hoping that today's event will have you feeling that way as you leave here. And at this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Gwen Hart, and she will introduce our speaker because she knows her much better than I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. It is my pleasure today to introduce my former colleague, Dr. Swasti Bhattacharyya. I know I have personally learned a lot from Swasti, who has a very unique background. She worked as a registered nurse for 10 years, and she also holds a PhD in religion and social ethics from the University of Southern California. Swasti is a professor emerita of philosophy and religion from Buena Vista University in Storm Lake, Iowa. She just finished a fellowship at Harvard Divinity School, where she taught for a year and worked on a research project. She is headed next to India on a Fulbright to finish her book on radical inclusive love, Sodavaya in Action, in which she is studying followers of Gandhi and Vinoba Bhave, who was a disciple and spiritual successor to Gandhi. She's here today to talk about curiosity and cultural humility. Please join me in welcoming her.
So, you can hear me without a mic? Because it's easier, then we don't have the thing to wake everybody up. Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Dr. Hart, and thank you, Dr. Campbell, for this opportunity. You were mentioning we come from different areas, right? Different backgrounds. And those influence who we become. And my father was from India, and he was born and raised and died a Hindu. My mother was Japanese from Hawaii. And she, because of my father, ended up converting to Christianity. She was raised a Buddhist. And so then my parents chose to raise us in Southern California in a pretty conservative Christian environment. And so when you look at that petri dish out of which I came, where there was all this diversity, right? I had Hinduism, I had Indian, Japanese, Buddhist, and Christianity in my household. I grew up thinking, wow, there's all these different ways to think. And I remember when I was in 5th grade, I'm walking home, and I thought, if what I learned in school today is true, then my daddy is going to hell. And I thought, well, I have a problem with that, right? So I got home, and I said, hey, Daddy, do you believe in reincarnation? And then he proceeded to explain to me how this idea could work. And I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. So now as an adult, when I do applied ethics from multiple religious perspectives, right? Because I think our religious and our cultural backgrounds influence how we make decisions. And that's really important to me, is how do we make decisions? And our backgrounds influence that. So that's related to this idea of curiosity and cultural humility. Now, when you see that, how many of you have even heard of the term cultural humility? Nobody. Okay. Think about it for a minute, though, so you don't know any, you've never heard it. What do you imagine it could mean? Take a minute and talk with the people next to you. What do you imagine cultural humility is? And I wasn't sure if I was going to have students or faculty or staff, and it seems most of you are students. What do you think? You can't be wrong, because I said, what do you think? Say it again?
Being judged in different cultures of what you believe.
So being judged because of different cultural ideas. Okay? Okay? So, and with the idea of cultural humility, do you think they would want us to judge and want us to stereotype? Or to question that? To question that, right? And I just told you that, where I came out of, right? There's a lot of different stuff going on, a lot of different ideas. So a lot of times I'm thinking, I don't know what's right? I don't know the answer. But part of life is being curious, right? And the reason why I have this picture here, so when I moved to Cambridge to go to Harvard, I had my cat with me. And you can see, he's like, what the hell is that? He's never seen a watermelon, and it's in his bed. And then notice he's like, wait, let me check it out. And that idea of curiosity and self-awareness are at the heart of what I consider is cultural humility. So what I want to do today is give you a little historical context of where this term comes from. Then we'll talk about humility, cultural humility, and then we'll have a discussion. And I do like to ask questions. My classrooms were always discussion-based, and so some students never took my classes. Other students realized, well, if she's asking us what I think, you can be wrong, but thinking, and that's how we learn, right? And I told them, I would teach Hinduism and Buddhism, and some of these kids had never even heard of Jainism. How many of you have heard of Jainism? Yeah, Jainism. It's a religious tradition that is indigenous to India. And it's a very minority tradition, but incredibly powerful in terms of what they teach and what they offer the world. So this is the plan. We'll see how we do. And if you have questions, you can interrupt me. We can throw this out the window. I like using PowerPoints because I'm a photographer. I like to show off my photography, which, by the way, did any of you recognize that photograph? What it is?
Badlands?
It might be that. I don't know what they're called. It's the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I was driving and it said scenic stop. I'm like, okay, let me see what's there. And that's what that is. All right, and then I'm not paying attention this time, so you just let me know. And we can play this by ear. So, cultural competency is a term that was coined by Dr. Madeline Leininger. She was in nursing, and she was developing a transcultural nursing theories. And she came up with this term. In that time, it was really important because she realized, and think about this, with nursing and any healthcare professional, if you don't know people's religious and cultural beliefs, it can actually be damaging. When I was in nursing school, I was reading this article, and the chart says, patient refused to take insulin. The patient happened to be a Muslim, and before 1982, do any of you know where we derived insulin? Anybody know?
From a pig.
Yep, from a pig. Anybody know anything about pigs in Islam?
Aren't they sacred or something?
Say it again?
Aren't they sacred?
No, they're forbidden, right?
Forbidden or something?
Forbidden, right? So a practicing Muslim, and you can't say all Muslims because there are plenty of Muslims that eat whatever, but one that's observant is not going to eat pork, right? And they're not going to want to touch anything that has to do with pork. So was the patient being non-compliant, or was the healthcare professionals not culturally competent to tell him, well, it's after 1982, and after 1982, insulin was derived from a synthetic source that didn't have anything to do with pigs, right? So you could see where that's important information to pass on. They didn't do that. This book, I don't know if any of you have heard of it. I read it when I was writing my dissertation. It was written in 97, I think. And it tells the story of this little Hmong child that's brought to the hospital in Merced, California, and she's experiencing epilepsy. Well, in the Hmong culture, and her family was one of the first refugees to resettle in the United States. And they saw this epilepsy, these seizures, as a connection to the spirit world. Right? But they bring her into the hospital in Merced, and they give her prescriptions that the parents felt were making her worse, and so they didn't give it to them all, give them the medications to her. She ended up being removed from the family because of Child Protection Services. Got involved, saying these parents are abusing this child. Again, the healthcare professionals didn't take the time to learn about why is it, what is their view of this, right? Because if your child is connected to the spirit world, you don't want to necessarily break that, right? But if they were to work with them, it could help. So you can see where having an idea and understanding of somebody's culture is important. Now the issue is, think about this word competency. Now from what Gwen mentioned, you have some nursing students here. There's a big diesel program. What does competency mean? Anybody? Understanding. Like in nursing, when I was in nursing, we literally had a list. And once you checked off that checklist, you were competent. You would gain mastery over putting in IVs or doing whatever it is that you're supposed to do. You've gained the skills of that thing that you need to do. The problem with that, here, so the focus is gaining mastery. Now think about what you know about religion and culture. Can you gain mastery over a culture or a religion? Think about your own family traditions, right? You have siblings, you have aunts and uncles. Does your whole family see the world the same way? Right? I've never met a family yet, right, where everybody sees it the same way. You're coming out of the same traditions, and yet you experience the world differently. Right? And as one who teaches religious studies, I will tell you in the field, there is no agreed upon definition of religion. Right? So we're religion scholars, religious studies scholars, but we can't agree on what it means or how to define it, right? Because it's really complex. So in this is why I do this. I put the numbers on the slide so I can keep track because I don't always read this. In 1998, you had Travelon and Mary Garcia coin this term, cultural humility. And when I learned that, I'm like, this is going to work. Because the problem with competency is I always had a problem that there's something wrong with this, right? We can't gain mastery. And actually, you could see how, again, it would do more harm. And like, oh, Hindus believe X. And you walk into my office and I'm your physician. Oh, you're a Hindu, so that means you think X and you want X. Can you see how that's actually, again, doing more harm, right? Because you're not being open and listening and seeing who's coming before you. With cultural humility, the focus becomes learning. And it's a paradigm for learning where rather than focusing on gaining mastery of knowledge, we're increasing our capacities to understand. Now back to when you were saying our childhood, one of the things for me is people didn't seem to understand me, right? Because I had all these different systems operating, and it wasn't until I got to grad school that a professor said, Swasti, you're not stupid, because I always felt I was stupid. I didn't understand enough, and if I was a little smarter, I wouldn't have all these questions. And she goes, you question presuppositions. And I'm like, what's a presupposition? Right? I didn't know what I was doing. But it's because I had these different systems operating, I didn't assume a certain body of knowledge to be absolutely true, or that's the way it is. Right? And that's what questioning those presuppositions are. So understanding is so important. And I don't care what you do. I don't care if you're a stay-at-home dad, a CEO, or a teacher. Whatever you go on to do, knowing who you are and understanding who you are and what you want to stand for and being able to articulate that, I really believe is the most important thing we can do in life. And then from that, we can understand other people. So that's what cultural humility is all about. So in your handout, now this is the activity part, so I'm not talking the whole time. If you want to pass them back, there's handouts. There's plenty of them. Go ahead and make sure at least somebody next to you has one. What I want you to know, you all said you haven't heard the term cultural humility, but we've talked very briefly about that idea of competence versus humility. So what I want you to do, you'll see this chart, and it gives you attributes, and then it describes it under either competence or humility. So this side, focus on attributes 1 through 4, and this side, 5 through 8. And then pair up with somebody that's sitting next to you, and then just pick one within that, the list. And talk about with your partner about what you can imagine, what are the implications of operating out of one or the other. So the question is, working off of your life experience, so you don't know much, you never heard cultural humility, so it's not that you're expert on that. Imagine what the implications of actions or responses that would be coming out of one of those two. So you pick one, look at it with cultural humility, look at it with competence. What's the difference? What do you see that how would a response be different? Does that make sense? So I'll give you a couple minutes, kind of do it.
So we got 5 through 8, right?
Well, you just pick one through, one of the 5 through 8. You understand what I'm asking you to do? So you see this. This is the attribute, and that's describing it. So pick one of them. Okay. So when that description and this description, what are the implications? What would somebody's actions look like if they were coming out of this attitude or this attitude?
Do you want us to do like similarities and differences, or just differences?
What an implication. So an implication is if it's coming at it, like you said, similar, you said broad, or what was the other word you used?
Like it's very direct. This
Yeah.
one is similar in tradition.
And so
Like
what's the implication of if somebody's really direct, what does that mean? How's that going to influence their responses or their actions? Again, I'm into applied ethics, so it's how we live. Take another 30 seconds and we'll come together.
That's an interesting point. I was wondering the same thing. I think she's saying. This one definitely seems better from her perspective, but I'm not sure how that's.
We're at the girls, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I guess like.
Do you have an extra one? Thank you. No, I just need one so that I don't have this memorized. Okay. So now that you've mastered it, no. So what do you see? What did you learn? What ideas do you have? What's the difference? Can I pick on the two of you?
Yeah, so we chose traditions,
Okay.
and we thought that everyone's traditions everyone has traditions, but everyone's traditions are going to be different depending on their values and how they view things. And
Okay.
I guess is what it-
So there's a lot of diversity in that?
Yeah.
Good. Anybody else with traditions?
We also picked tradition.
Okay.
We just talked about how we don't understand that we are always following traditions, and that traditions is not a older term, I guess, in history. It's still going on. There's always traditions, and others may think just immigrants and others just follow traditions, but everybody's following traditions always.
Right, because they're all different, right? But when you said we, who do you, in your head, who was the we?
Like everybody that's, everybody, I guess, right? Because everybody that's really not part of a cultural background, I guess, something like that, or more of a, I can't put a point on it.
Everybody comes from a cultural background, right? And, not but, and a lot of times people in the dominant culture, which generally speaking, again, you can get into trouble when you do that, but is white, right, in the United States. Now that's changing, right, and we can see what happens when that's changing. People get upset right? Because now their worldviews are starting to change. But I had a student come into my class, and they had to talk about worldview. And first of all, he was like, who gives an assignment before the first day of class? And it was like, well, it was a baseline. And the baseline was, what is worldview? What's your word association? What do you think it is? Kind of like what I did with cultural humility, right? Because if you think about it before you learn something, then when you learn something, you can go, oh, I was here. Now I'm here. I've learned something. He comes into class and he says, well, I don't have a worldview. And he was very proud of himself. He was a white male in Northwest Iowa, so he was definitely part of the dominant culture there, the one that had been in power. And I said, oh, well, we'll see about that. So a lot of times the idea is the standard culture is the dominant one. Now, I just got back from India. A white male there, that's not the dominant culture, right? It's different. But you see what I'm saying, right? A lot of people think, oh, they're the ones that have culture. We all do, right? And sometimes it's invisible, right, when it's the dominant culture. And people think, well, Christmas isn't a religious thing, it's a secular thing. I'm like, oh, really? Where did that come from? Now, has it been secularized in this country? Yes, right? You have atheists that are, observing Christmas because it's a national holiday. Not in India, right? I was in Jerusalem after high school, and I was taking a class, and these other students from the U.S. were really upset that we had class on Christmas. They're like, how can they do that? And I'm like, where are we? We're in Jerusalem. They're not Christian, that's not the dominant culture. So everyone has it. Okay, what's another one from this side?
You talked about the focus, seeing people based on their group, whatever group we think they're in, versus seeing everyone as an individual and how their experiences are unique, or they're not like what we were relating it to what you were saying about, well, if you're a Hindu, you obviously think this and do this, but maybe not. Maybe there's some other influences you
have to consider, right? I mean, so I'm assuming now, again, that can get dangerous. To me, you appear as a white male, right? But I was talking to this one guy that didn't believe white male privilege existed. Like, he's in his 70s, and we had some issues. But anyway, he's an older guy. He grew up in Watts. His mother was Jewish, and his dad was Italian. And I thought, Swasti, give him a break. He's 78 years old. He doesn't think he's white. Because when he was growing up in Watts, poor, he wasn't part of the dominant culture, even though it was white. He didn't see his position of privilege, which was very frustrating for me, and I'm not saying it was easy. But I kept saying, Swasti, you keep talking about cultural humility, then you be one who will listen to him and hear his story. Right? Now, we still did have an issue. I won't say it ended in roses, and I will not work with him again. But I now had made I was making choices, but I was trying to be more open, right? And we'll get to another thing. It's a lifelong process. So before, this ends at what time?
Anytime you want, but they have to be back in class till 1.
Okay, so I won't keep you late. And if it starts you can wave your hand and say, I need to go. What I wanted to do is talk about humility and the definition of humility. For you all, when you hear the word humility, what do you think? Do you have positive or negative reactions? Negative. Why? If you dig it, and a lot of my students did too. So when I first started playing with this idea of cultural humility and I was learning about it, I thought, I got to jettison this term humility. Because my students were just I'm not going to be humble. And you look at, our current former president, humility is not something that seems to go well with Trump, right? And I'm not trying to be disparaging. I think he would say that, right? So then I did a deep dive into humility. And if you do a search and you look at dictionaries, Cambridge Dictionary, the quality of not being proud because you're aware of your bad qualities. Oxford, having a lowly opinion of oneself. You don't have a lowly opinion of yourself. Google search, and this is when I did it, so who knows what you'd find now, a modest or low view of one's own importance, humbleness. That's pretty negative, right? This usually comes across as a noun, and I thought, well, no wonder people don't want that term. So then I kept digging, though, and I found this definition, where cultural humility is more of on a continuum, and it comes between this idea of pride and humiliation, and humility is in the middle. So you can see how there's a little more, it's a little more dynamic and a little more nuanced. You've probably met people that think they know everything. They don't have anything to learn from anybody else, so why should I bother learning about you? Because I know it all. And then, you know, on this other side, oh, what a worm that I am, I have nothing to offer, right? And humility's in between. I thought, okay, this is a little better. And then I kept reading, and I came up, of course, it has 3 parts, and it's really complicated, but that's because life is complicated, right? Now let me get to those notes so I don't forget which ones they are. Because I like this. It took me a while to, and it's a working definition, notice, because I'm still working on it. I'm still learning and broadening my understanding of humility. So, number 1, humility is self-reflection. That it's a true, more accurate understanding of yourself. It doesn't require us to have a low view of ourselves, but it's also not when we're enamored with ourselves, where we think we're all that, right? It's kind of in between where you have an accurate view. So when I was teaching at USC as a grad student, I had been in grad school for a long time. In all, I think it was 13 years. And that's grad school. So people had kids, I was collecting academic degrees. So I'm at USC, and I give my first lecture. And it worked really well, and I was shocked, and I was excited. So I call home, and I'm like, it was so good, and da-da-da-da. And my father says in Sanskrit, he quotes some Sanskrit verse, and then he translated, the tree that is full of fruit is low to the ground. And I'm like, darn it, it's not that I'm not humble. I just saw that I could do this, right? That I've spent so much time and energy thinking I wanted to be an educator, and I can actually do it. People were actually paying attention. You know, and I remember I looked up, and I'm like, oh my God, they're taking notes. It's like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what I'm doing. I know I studied, but I'm always learning. So it's not that I didn't know anything. Right, I can talk to you all, and I can learn because you ask questions that I never thought of, but that doesn't mean I don't have something to contribute, right? So I can stand firm in who I am without being haughty and without not thinking I have something to contribute. That takes a lot of work to get to that. So B, self-understanding within the context of the world. We don't live in little isolated islands, right? We live in this world where you have all these other ideas. So how do I bring that understanding of who I am in the context of this university, of my classmates, of my colleagues, right, of people that I'm working with? And we start to realize that at its core, humility is an ethically aligned experience of ourself in relationship to everything else. So it's not just us, but how do I interact with you? How do I learn from you, and how do you learn from me? Importantly, so it's a shift of our focus away from just us, but not meaning, oh, I'm not important. But it's a shift in our focus to say, how do my needs and interests correspond to the needs and interests of those around me? Right? So you take that into consideration. And then the third part is grounded in action. So my understanding of myself and my understanding that I'm not an island, I'm interacting with others, then how does that control or influence how I interact with others? And again, I do applied ethics because I don't care if you can clearly explain deontology or if you can explain some philosophical idea, but you don't know how to treat the person next to you. That's what's important, is how do we live together? We can have totally different political, religious, whatever views, but I can still treat you as a human being and as an equal, right? And still have a common idea if we can come to that. So this is a pretty nuanced understanding of humility, and it's one that's always dynamic and changing. So now that gets us to a definition of cultural humility. And again, it's a three-part process. Everything's a process with me because you never arrive. Cultural humility is a process that requires humility as individuals continually engage in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners. So what does that mean? Right? It's a process that begins with knowing who we are. If I want to understand you, I got to know who I am. Right? Because if I'm not clued into that, you'll say something or do something, and it might trigger something in me, and I'll react. Right? It's when we know who we are, we can act instead of react. Now that gets into a whole field of psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but there's elements of that are true. Think about, have you ever gotten really angry? And you're like, why am I so pissed off? And for me, when that happens, I'm like, okay, this is something in you that's being triggered. So figure out what that is, right? And that comes through a lot of therapy and talking to, I had a lot of friends that are psychologists. This stuff really works. But knowing who you are is at the base of that. Lifelong learners, what does that mean? What does it mean, do you think?
I guess just not, it kind of comes back to that idea of thinking that you can just master something, I would say.
Yeah.
Kind of that lifelong openness and willingness to expand your understanding of something.
Exactly, right? You're always learning. You know, we were just talking about a student, this first-year student walks into the classroom, and he just knew everything. He knew everything, and I'm like, damn, must be nice. You know, you're 17 or 18, and he knew everything. Junior year, he's in my office, and I said, you know, Matthew, you are really smart. And he was. I said, but I tell you, when you walk into the room thinking you're the smartest person in the room, you cut off opportunities to learn. I will walk into a room of first graders, and I will not assume I know more than them about anything. You never know. And then Roger, Gwen's husband, was just talking about, he was teaching 7th grade, and they were out looking at trees, and he goes, oh, that's a maple, and that's a something. And then he goes, a student asked, well, what's this bush? And he's like, I don't know. And then the 7th grader gives the Latin name for it, and he's looking at her like, how the hell do you know that? Her father was a nursery. You know, he owned a nursery. So she learned the Latin words. She knew. You always be open to learning, right? That's what lifelong means. Reflective practitioners, that we think about how we're acting, right? So it doesn't just stay in our heads. How does it influence how we act? Okay, number 2, cultural humility is a process that requires humility by those in power to check power imbalances that exist in relationships, both individually and in groups, and work to equalize them. It is not enough to acknowledge there's an imbalance, right? You all are students, you have teachers. When I was in 7th grade, my 7th grade teacher said, Indira Gandhi was Mahatma Gandhi's daughter. And I'm thinking, really? I don't think so. My dad worked with Gandhi, right? He was in the ashram with Gandhi when he was young. So I go home and I'm like, Daddy, is Indira Gandhi related to Gandhi? He's like, no, they're not even in the same caste. So I come back to 7th grade the next day. I don't say anything in front of class, right, because I don't want to embarrass my teacher. But afterwards I said, you know, I was talking to my dad. Indira Gandhi's not related to Gandhi. And she starts to argue with me. Now, she's the teacher. I'm just a 7th grader. What do 7th graders know? But I happen to be a 7th grader whose father worked with Gandhi. Right? But she didn't have that idea. She was the teacher, and she knew. I was like, okay, fine. I'm not going to argue with you. Right? But so there's power imbalances in the classroom, but if we're educators and we're wanting to learn, we're always open to that. Third thing. Oh, one other thing, though. Let me back up a minute. How do we do this in terms of check the power imbalances? Is you listen. And you listen for the answers and you care about what they're going to say. How many of us ask questions, but as the person's talking, we're already thinking of our response? And if we're doing that, we're not really listening, right? And there's a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And Arlie Hochschild, she's a sociologist, she was trying to understand why does it seem that people are on the right, so these Tea Party Republicans specifically, it seems like some of these people are voting in ways that are against their self-interest. What's going on? And she coins a term, deep story. And the deep story is the stories that feelings tell. Notice the story that feelings tell, not logic. That's why when I sit there and I look at my friend, how can you think of that? That doesn't make any sense. It's not about logistical sense. It's about how it makes them feel. So if I really want to connect with you and learn something, I have to put aside some of that sometimes to listen. What are the hopes and fears that are being addressed by this idea that you're hanging on to? That's a really important thing. Now, again, make it sound like it's all peaches and roses, and it's not. You know, it's difficult, very difficult. Okay, number 3. Cultural humility is a process that requires humility to develop and maintain mutually respectful, dynamic, there's that word again, partnerships with communities and individuals. Mutually respectful means that we see each other as equals. Think about how this world would be different if we could do that, right? Equals doesn't mean the same, right? We're not all the same. And when I teach religious studies, students goes, oh, all religions are the same. Well, if you mean that religion is where we talk about that transcendent realm, then yeah, I guess it's the same. But believing that we're all God is much different than believing that God is there and humans are here. That's not the same, right? It's very different ideas. So it's same respect and equality don't mean the same, right? That we can value that diversity, but how do we do that? We can only value diversity if we really have respect for that, and we see that there's mutually respectful. Dynamic, again, anything I do is dynamic, right? None of us have arrived. And believe me, I wish that would be the case, right? I would love to be one that has arrived, but I haven't. Okay, so in summary, cultural humility is a paradigm of learning that's grounded in humility, right? We don't think we know all that. It's a dynamic process of transformation. Most transformative is us, right? I'm not trying to transform you. I'm working on me. Acknowledging that it's the complexities of life, right? Too many times we like to have nice, neat little things. Well, life isn't that way. Leads to ethical actions, right? I mean, that's really important on how we act. Requires a lifelong commitment, and this can lead to a whole person living environment, right? Where we can be learning and being able to engage with each other. So that's a taste of how I see cultural humility and why I think it's important. And we have time, right? A little bit of time? A few minutes, yeah. For a question? Questions, answers, discussions? You can think I got it all wrong. Let me say this, though. After January 6th, I was supposed to give a talk on cultural humility. And I was in this group, and it was on Zoom, and this person exploded and was really upset. And it's like, oh, this is all fine and good, but this is life and death, right? And they were like, people are dying. People, you know, how do you do this? And I really struggled. I'm like, you're all about trying to understand people, but how do you understand when people won't even agree on what some common facts are? And so for me personally, I'm grounding this foundation of cultural humility in a commitment to be a seeker of truth. Now notice I said a seeker, one who's pursuing truth, not truth itself. Because what is truth, right? That old saying, truth, what is truth? It's really difficult. But if we're all saying I'm really looking to see what's true, then that means that you're open to other ideas. Because it gets really hard otherwise, and I really struggle with that. And then the other thing, and again, this is coming out of my background in Gandhian thought and stuff, is this idea, this commitment to nonviolence. That if I'm committed to truth and to nonviolently engaging with people, then you can see how this cultural humility can work. Otherwise, there are challenges. And then the other last thing is sarvodaya means the uplifting of all. And Vinoba and Gandhi believed that India would progress and the world would progress only when we were going to bring everybody forward. And there's too many times that society or we will marginalize other people. And notice I say we marginalize. People don't choose to stay on the margins and not be involved. They're pushed aside. So if we would open our understanding of when we say we, who is that we, and expand it to make sure we're not leaving anybody behind. Right? So those are different attitudes that are this culture of humility and this idea, this commitment to trying to understand are grounded in. Because it is complicated. And like, I don't know, I keep telling myself, how would you try to understand, I don't want to get too political, but somebody who I just totally disagree with? How do I do that? And that's my challenge, right? And that's why it's a process. How do I look at somebody that I can't stand and say, wait, they are worthy of respect? And how do I do that? So, I can keep talking, but I'll stop.
So you bring up sort of an interesting perspective. You said this is your research into life as understanding. Going back to the unexamined life isn't worth living philosophy. In these trying times, how do we, as a culture, society, if you're challenged by how to do it, how do the rest of us get there?
We keep putting one foot in front of the other. So another thing out of Indian philosophy is this idea of non-attachment, right? And Vinoba, in 1951, it's a long story, but the quick end is he started walking in India, asking people who had land to give land to those who did not have any. And he did, again, it's a whole story, but for 14 years, he walked from village to village to village. And the picture I have in my mind, you know the cartoon where you have this person going and then behind them is just all chaos, right? Just a bunch of mess and chaos. That's kind of like what I picture. His job was to give people the opportunity to give. He didn't care. I mean, the Gita talks about you do your job. It's better to do your calling, your job imperfectly than to do somebody else's perfectly. You do the best job you can, and then you let it go. And you keep going, because you're not attached to the results, right? And again, that's done in a context of ahimsa and all that, because otherwise, Hitler wasn't attached to it. Well, no, that's not what they're saying. But that's one of the ways, is that you just keep going forward. And one of the people I interviewed, he had worked with Gandhi and Vinoba, and I was really discouraged. And I'm like, don't you get discouraged? You've worked for peace all your life, and this world is so messed up. You didn't even make a difference. And he looks at me and he goes, do you care? And I'm like, well, of course I do. And he goes, well then, shucks. So my job, if my job is to work for peace and understanding, the fact that you don't, that's not my problem. My job is to do what I can to the best of my ability. Now, on one hand, you could argue that's a lame answer. But that's his answer to me, right? And when you look at it globally, I don't want to be one that's making the world more complicated. No, I do like to complicate it, more violent or more non-accepting. Well, then I'm going to try. So, I mean, and the sisters that I've been interviewing for 20 years, they can't do it. I see the tensions in that community, and I ask them the same question, and then I realize the answer is, if you want to work for peace, peace doesn't come from the earth. It doesn't come from the sky, it comes from us. And so then we have to act in that way. We act for what we want. And then I love that idea of non-attachment. It's hard. It's really hard when you dedicate your life to something and it's not going in that direction to say, I just got to let it go, right? But you still keep moving forward. I don't know. What do you think? Is it a lame answer? It's the only one I got.
No, I mean, it's a good one. I mean, we're here because we're interested in the concept, and I think we all have the similar kind of goals of a more connected society. So how do we, with our upbringing, which and cultural norms and all that, we've got a whole variety of them here. How do we, what do we do as individuals and then as a collective to bring that environment environment more to the forefront.
Well,
I know, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know some students have to go to class, so maybe could we,
Yeah.
could we give some,
yes.
some thanks to Swasti, and people who want to stay and talk from afterwards are welcome to. So thank you so much.
Yes, if you need to go. Thank you.